Hello everybody, my name is Stephen Hirsch and we are Athena School of Arms, and this is our presentation on fighting with swords. Thank you for joining us for our first ever videotaped, socially distanced version of our usual fair and convention sort of presentation. I hope you're enjoying Jewelry City Steampunk Festival so far, and I hope you're excited about swords in the same way that I am constantly excited about swords. So, what do we do? Starting in the 14th century, people who trained in the use of swords started writing down the instruction they received and how to use those swords. And so our group, and groups like ours all over the world, work from those original sources, from those manuscripts that were written in the 14th century and onward, to reconstruct historical European martial arts. And what we do is martial arts. We don't do stage fighting, it's not choreographed, and it's also not a live action role play event. We don't take on particular personas as part of this. We, for the most part, actually wear relatively modern gear and use modern manufactured equipment for training historical fencing, historical sword play. So what we do at our club consists of several parts. The biggest part is drills. So these are establishing all of your foundations like footwork and handwork, and then combining those together and doing partner drills where we're learning how to react to a person and work with things like timing and distance. And then the drills get progressively more challenging, progressively more freeform until they're relatively close to what free fencing is like, as a way to study and develop free fencing skills. Because for us, the primary outcome that we're looking at is, all right, can we take the techniques that exist in our sources and then apply them against a resisting opponent? That brings me to the next piece of what we do. So we do free fencing as a regular part of our training, and we also do competition. And the thing about competition in this is that it provides us an opportunity to know that the other person's not cooperating. When we do our drills, even our very high level intense drills in class here, there's some amount of the other person is cooperating that's usually going on. Even if they're not consciously doing it, it's just a typical thing for your friends and training partners to do. Plus, there's also the fact that they've trained the same system as you. And so there's things they're going to do that are more predictable, for instance, as a result of that. Whereas when you go to a competition, you don't have that aspect of it anymore. Everyone there is competing for that same little plastic disc on a ribbon to put around their neck, and suddenly all bets are off for most people. And so you get the highest pressure stress test of how good you are at applying what you have been training. So we encourage and recommend competition, but I do want to make clear, it's not like we require competition. We don't make anyone compete. We don't hold it against anyone who doesn't want to compete. Some people aren't doing this because of their desire for that competitive component, and we try and make sure that our program is accommodating for those sorts as well. So we have a variety of different kinds of interest and degrees of interest within our club when it comes to studying historical fencing. One of the other components of our training is cutting. So that's when we take actual sharp swords, all right, and we use them against standardized targets. It's a solo activity, which I feel the need to point out because most times when I do this in public and I have audience members, I have at least one person in the audience who needs me to point out that when we're using sharp swords, it's a solo activity. And so then we cut targets, all right? The majority of the time, what we're cutting is tatami, which some of you may be familiar with because it's used in Japanese sword arts for tamashigiri, which is test cutting with the katana and other weapons. And we use that because it is a useful training tool, because it provides us information to improve the quality of our actions. And by having a significant piece of our overall training approach include cutting, what we end up with is a situation where when I am free fencing, I have a good sense of, were this a real sword fight? Were this the hypothetical real sword fight that I'll never actually get into, thankfully? I have confidence that what I'm doing would work, that it would produce the outcomes and effects that we see described in manuals, that we see described in pictures from the time. And so I know that my sword works. This also has the effect that at tournaments, the judges from my club tend to be the harder judges because we actually know whether or not that cut would have hit to a higher degree, and so we tend to set a somewhat higher bar for what constitutes a good hit in competition. So that gives you a general outline of what we do here at Athena School of Arms. And there's one other component not directly related to sword work that we include as a normal part of our classes. And that is a strength and conditioning part of what we do. So sword fighting is, of course, a physically demanding thing. Also, exercise is generally good for people's health. And so we like to encourage that by having a strength and conditioning component of our classes as a way to make people more physically prepared to do sword fighting. And it also improves your performance outcomes, your competition outcomes, to have that physical preparedness if that's a factor that motivates you. Again, it's not the sort of thing we insist everyone do. So that's sort of an idea of what gives you a brief idea of what our total program is like. Over the course of this video, what you're going to see is demonstrations of sword fighting, a wide variety of weapons that we use here at Athena School of Arms. And you're also going to see us demonstrating some very basic drilling that is used for the broadsword. The broadsword being a very typical weapon for the period of time immediately before the Victorian era that is represented by the steampunk aesthetic, and it also continues to serve as a foundation for the kinds of weapons that are used throughout the steampunk Victorian era. So the next thing I want to do is talk about answering people's questions. So there are some questions that we routinely get at fairs. We get almost every time. And so I'm going to try and answer those questions now, even though I can't ask you questions live, which I always enjoy. So one of the first and most basic questions that we get are the swords real? And the short answer to that question is yes, they are. And what I mean by the fact that the swords are real, I'm going to grab one of my long swords here, right, is that the training swords that we use are as realistic as we can make them while still being able to train safely. The way reality works is that the more accurate my training equipment is, the more it's just a weapon. And we don't actually want to fight with weapons, which is why the sharp swords are used only for training activities. But this training sword here, this is dedicated piece for training. It is used only for training purposes and has some specific characteristics that are different from the sword on the battlefield would be. So it's got a narrower blade that allows it to have a thicker blade. That makes it safer for us to free fence with. It's got plenty of flex to it, which is going to make it safer when we're thrusting. But other than that, it's fairly similar to a real sword. It's got the same kind of balance, it's got the same kind of weight, it's made from basically the same sorts of materials, and so it gives us a very accurate piece with which to simulate sword fighting with. And so in that sense, they are very close to being real swords without being sharp and without being unreasonably dangerous. They do present a sufficient level of danger that we do have to wear substantial protective gear for our actual fencing, and you'll see that in the free fencing segment that comes later in this video here. And we wear all of that gear because we have to, not because it's comfortable. And so it's because these things would hurt if we weren't wearing the appropriate protective gear. So yes, the swords are, for the most part, real. One of the common questions we get is the idea of a fight between sword and shield and a longsword like the one Mika here has. So first of all, for those of you not already familiar with a shield like this kind of shield is what's known as a buckler. And it's also where the term swashbuckling comes from, because it refers to sword and buckler fighters who would go around at night being gangs of hoodlums in 13th century London doing this. All right? And that's literally what swashbuckling refers to. So this is a personal defense shield. This is not going to be used commonly on the battlefield because when I have to deal with missile weapons, this doesn't do a good job of protecting me. But against an opponent with a sword, all right, this is big enough because I can cover basically every line of attack my opponent has with barely any movement of the sword. So this shield is a good shield for personal combat. And we end up with a fight between sword and shield here and a long sword. Now I want to show you what the length difference is between these two swords here. So you can see that there's not actually a huge difference in length between these two swords. So a big part of, and then that length difference ends up not actually mattering that much because, come to long points here, all right, the person holding the two-handed sword is required to be in a position where they can reach the handle with both swords. I, on the other hand, have the advantage that I can profile myself enough that I wouldn't be in that position. And so I end up with a comparable reach, even though the blade itself is shorter, to my opponent. So he could cut my wrist here, I could cut his wrist here. I have the advantage in that scenario of he's trying to cut my wrist while I've tried to cut his, in that, come back to that long point position here, all right, I can defend my wrist at the same time I can do this. So the advantages of the longsword generally end up getting neutralized in the sword and buckler fight, and so it ends up being a fairly even fight, and ultimately the outcome of a fight like that isn't determined much by the weapons so much as it is by the skills and physical abilities of the fighters, and also by the understanding the fighters have of the relative strengths and weaknesses of their weapons in that particular matchup. If the sword and buckler fighter has never fought against a longsword before, is unfamiliar with the kinds of techniques that a longsword fighter is likely to use, the longsword fighter may be able to gain a significant advantage by playing off of those things. Whereas if the longsword fighter is very familiar with, whereas the sword and buckler fighter is very familiar with what a longsword fighter is going to do, it ends up becoming a much more challenging fight and a much more even fight. And you end up in the scenario, as is true plenty of time in the real world and in competition with sword fighting, where luck ends up playing a factor in terms of the outcome. So, our next common question that we get is asking about the concept of fighting with two swords. And the first and most basic answer to the question about fighting with two swords is that it was never common. There's no time or place where fighting with two swords is common. We have exceptionally few sources that talk about the idea of fighting with two swords, and there is one from talking about rapier, which refers to the concept of case of rapiers, which is a pair of matched rapiers, which is what I've approximated with these two rapiers here. All these are early period rapiers and not usually what people think about when they talk about rapiers. There is a single illustration which is labeled in Italian roughly as fencing in the Florentine style, which is how we end up with the thing where fighting with two swords is referred to as Florentine style. There's no other indication of that as sort of a general concept that exists in sword fighting. And fighting with two equal length weapons is challenging and also has its downsides. One of the things to think about in terms of its downsides is that in a one-on-one situation, it's got some reasonable advantages, but things you can take advantage of if you know what to do. But against multiple opponents, having a shield in your other hand is the much smarter option. So fighting with a sword and shield is much more common than fighting with two weapons because this gives me very good defense, which gives me most of the advantages of having anything in my offhand and letting me offend with the sword. So that's a much more common approach to the idea of fighting with two weapons or fighting with something in each hand. When we do see fighting with two weapons rather than the two equal length swords concept, what we see more often is something like fighting with weapons of unequal length, such as sword and dagger. We see this plenty in rapier manuals. There is a small amount of it that exists in broadsword tradition with weapons like this. This gets referred to as an alehouse dagger because apparently there was a time and place where this is what you brought with you to go out drinking with your buddies. You know, just in case you're wondering about whether or not the past was a better place. No. So fighting with unequal length weapons gives us the ability to cut past the other weapon easily and offend with the sword as our primary weapon and use this primarily for defensive actions, all right? and also used for close-in action. So when I get close to my opponent, all right, and potentially if they, for instance, bound up my sword here, I can go in and use this weapon to offhand and defend at that range, at that close range distance, which gives me an advantage that I didn't otherwise have, gives me attacks that I can make that the other person wasn't necessarily expecting. But of course, it's a trade-off, and the idea that it's a trade-off is a constant throughout our discussion of weapons. Any given approach to any given weapon and its weapon system is a series of trade-offs between the advantages and disadvantages of any given approach. And this is a big part of why we see changes over the course of time in the weapons, that the factors that are important change over time. And that feeds into why changes in weapons happen. So, one of the other topics that frequently comes up is stage fighting. And there are lots of things I could say about stage fighting, and I have a list of my favorite movie fight scenes that I could talk about. But there's a very particular action that very frequently shows up in choreographed movie and stage fighting scenes that I want to talk about here, because it's the one that drives me nuts the most because of how ridiculous it is. But I do want to take a moment briefly to address why stage fighting is always going to be and should be different from real sword fighting. Right? One, if the actors aren't wearing any protective gear, their safety is the highest priority. So whereas in a real sword fight, or in fencing in a competitive sense, hitting the other person is your highest priority. So we have these two opposing objectives to start off with in the difference between choreographed fighting and a real fight or free fencing. One of the other key points is that in stage fighting and choreographed fighting, you want the audience to be able to tell what's going on. Whereas in a real sword fight, you want no one to be able to tell what you're doing because you're trying to trick them. So this is another way in which we get these two opposing goals. And so of course they're going to end up looking different. And so I do understand that when I point out this thing that drives me nuts. And that is the thing that we see in plenty of sword fight scenes where we come to this clash here, right? And our heroes just press into the sword. It's more of like who has the most will and strength that determines the outcome of this. This is garbage. This is a stupid way to fight. Real people didn't fight this way. Okay? So what a smart fighter is going to do is attempt to gain some sort of leverage or advantage. The simplest and most direct technique in one of our traditions is simply to do this. Right? When I do this, the strong part of my sword is up by the weak part of my sword, and now my point is threatening my opponent, and I can deliver a thrust from there. Right? I'm fighting smarter than my opponent rather than harder than my other opponent. There's another technique that we could do, which is much safer for people who aren't wearing protective gear, though. All right? Because that technique involves me putting the point of my steel prop sword in the face of an expensive actor. And so understandably, insurance companies don't want that. So the other option is if we're here and my opponent is pushing really hard, I do this. All right? I yield to their force, which is another way in which I can fight smarter rather than harder. And this puts me in a position to be able to pommel them in the face, right? So smashing someone in the face with the pommel of your sword, real good way to improve your odds of winning the sword fight. It's the sort of thing for which safe techniques already exist in terms of how stage fighting is taught. And it also demonstrates me fighting smarter than the other person. Anyone who's familiar with certain Eastern martial arts traditions, or probably grappling-oriented ones, are probably familiar with the idea of using your opponent's strength against them. I'm not going to try and meet my opponent force on force. The exact same concept shows up in 13th and 14th century European longsword fighting manuals, because there is a lot of overlap between martial arts fighting traditions from place to place and period to period. So we shouldn't be surprised by that. So I can fight smarter than my opponent rather than fighting harder than my opponent. And I could do something much better looking than what we typically see. So one other piece about choreographed stage fighting that we see that I want to talk about in particular because of the recent popularity of the TV show The Witcher, which I have not watched, but I've seen clips of the fight scenes in it. And we get our hero holding a sword like this instead of like this. And so holding the sword upside down like this shows up in a minuscule fraction of period depictions. And I think there might be like 1 or 2 techniques total over a corpus that stretches to thousands of different techniques in the use of a sword, where the sword is intentionally held like that. And there are some basic limitations to trying to use a sword that way that are very important to understand why that's not how swords are meant to be used. So the first is range. This is the difference in range between my ability to do things with these 2 weapons, all right? The other is my ability to cut things, all right? So I can't cut in anything like the usual mechanics that I would use for cutting with a sword here, all right? I can like do this sort of a slash here, which is the sort of thing you typically end up seeing in the stage choreography, but like that'll matter, that'll affect the outcome of a fight. And I'm not saying it's not worth doing at all, but I am saying that it doesn't do as much as if I simply do the exact same thing holding the sword correctly. It's not going to do as much. The other thing you could do when you're holding a sword upside down like this is stab with it, which brings us to historically what was better. If you're going to hold it upside down, the dagger is great for that, all right? And so with a dagger, I can hold my dagger like this, and now I basically have steel armor protecting my arm, and I can parry like this with the dagger, and when I get close to my opponent, I can stab them. So holding the weapon upside down, this ice pick grip for a dagger, super common with daggers, super rare for very good reasons with a sword. One of the other topics that frequently comes up is differences between both weapons and fighting styles between different cultures. So in general, Eastern martial arts, such as from China and Japan, are something that folks are more familiar with as a concept, and there's a lot of popularity with weapons like the katana as sort of this idea that it's a great weapon. And that the weapons from this culture or that culture and so on and so forth are intrinsically great weapons. And it's very frequently the case in Western culture that our weapons aren't thought of as being as good. And so the first thing I want to address about the weapons is that any given weapon in any period of time, in any place, is the best weapon that can be made with what's available. And what's available primarily has to do with technological development and infrastructure development. For instance, the folding technique that katanas are famous for is actually more a processing and ore refining technique that was necessary because the iron ore that was available on the islands of Japan is crap. And it required extra processing. And that was the best technique that was available for doing that processing. Similar techniques for similar reasons were being done in Europe in the first millennium. So folding the metal that swords are being made out of shows up in somewhere around 600 to 700, if I'm remembering correctly, in Central Europe, being done by Celtic peoples. And so nifty pattern welding of the kind that Middle Eastern and Japanese swords are frequently famous for, again, also shows up in Europe before it shows up in either of those places. Viking era swords, Norse culture swords, also frequently have pattern welding. And in all of these places, the common characteristic between why they do these techniques is because it's what's necessary to produce good swords with what's available to them. By the high medieval era in Europe, they're no longer doing that because they have developed the infrastructure for making basically monosteel weapons that are as good as a folded weapon would be without having to go through the extra work of the folding process. And they do that by mass manufacturing. They produce blades that are just as good. In fact, there are accounts from Japan of interactions between Portuguese traders with European swords and Japanese soldiers with their swords, in which the Japanese conclude that the European swords are better. And I've explained some of the sort of metallurgical reasons why that's going to end up being the case. So any given culture's sword is based on what they can do and is the best they can do with what's available to them, and is also the best weapon for the way they fight. So long swords like this, which are intended to be used in two hands, show up at the same time that heavier armor shows up, such that I no longer require a shield in my other hand to keep myself safe in the battlefield, so putting both hands on my sword becomes a good option. And the places where single-handed swords, the places in time and the cultures where single-handed swords are predominant, are places where not as much armor is being worn. If you look at samurai armor, it possesses a similar characteristic to medieval and Renaissance European armor, in that it covers so much of your body that carrying a shield is not really necessary. And so having a two-handed sword makes sense. Another piece is about this idea of sharpness. Sharpness is not a characteristic intrinsic to the metal or to the sword design. It is simply the result of good, laborious maintenance. And professional sharpeners followed armies around in medieval Europe. Swords have been pulled out of storage from 5-6 centuries before, untouched by anyone until the archaeologist goes to pick it up. And archaeologists have lost fingers picking up European swords that had not been maintained in 500 years. Because yes, of course, those swords were just as sharp. The sharpness for which the katana is famous for is not a characteristic unique to that weapon. It is simply the result of basic and frankly fairly simple and easy labor. And we see variations in the sharpness of Japanese swords in Japanese historical sources, where there is an idea of civilian sharp, where I'm going to use my sword at most against opponents who are wearing their everyday clothing and are unarmored, all right, where having a very fine edge makes sense to be able to slice through silk clothing, versus battlefield sharp, where it's not as sharp, but the edge is more durable. And that's going to be more useful on a battlefield where my blade's going to be hitting hafts of spears, people's armor, other people's swords, things like this, before I manage to get to my opponent. So having a more durable edge makes sense there. So when we look at swords from both Japan and Europe and other cultures, we see variations in the way they construct the edge itself that reflect these ideas of, well, what's more important about the way I fight with this sword, and what does that mean in terms of how sharp it ends up being? One of the other concepts we can talk about is the martial arts systems themselves. There's actually published peer-reviewed research showing the enormous amount of overlap that exists between systems for the katana that show up in Japan and 14th and 15th century European longsword sources. There's only so many ways that people can move. The people who were doing this were professionals who represented centuries of experience in the development of the art by the time they're writing these things down. So we have a lot of expertise that goes into these techniques, and so they're all going to end up with good fighting systems and good techniques. Do we as practitioners have opinions about which sources are better than others? Like, sure, of course we do. I think Paulus Hector Meyer was much more of an enthusiastic amateur, and I'm not convinced about the quality of all of his techniques, but I think other sources from the same era and from roughly the same tradition are in fact sources from skilled professionals who had to kill people with their swords to be able to be alive to write the manuals that they wrote, and those techniques end up being very good. So one of the other pieces that we see is when we do grappling demonstrations, we get people who have trained in things like Aikido and Judo in the audience who are like, hey, I recognize that technique. And I'm like, yes, of course you do. I have a 16th century source that shows a picture of this. It's great. So there's an enormous amount of overlap, and it's not that one system was intrinsically better, the fighters of a particular system were particularly better, it's not that the warriors of any particular culture are intrinsically better, because they all have the benefit of expert instruction available to them, of centuries of experience going into how they sword fight. You know, differences are going to be based on things like how much training time those individuals have put into it, their physical capabilities, morale, context, things like this end up mattering much more to the outcome of individual fights and individual battles than the martial arts tradition or the weapons themselves. All right, so now comes the most exciting part of our presentation today. That is the hands-on lesson portion, where we're going to talk about how to use the broadsword. And what we're going to do to show you the broadsword is a drill that shows up in the 18th century and usually gets referred to as the manual drill. And there was a poster illustrating this drill that was used for training purposes. The point of the drill was to train basic soldiers in the use of the sword so that they would be confident in the use of the sword. Note Third, I didn't say competent. Competence cost more and was not included in your actual Army training. However, there were sword masters who tended to follow regiments around and offer their training, and those folks wrote some of the manuals that we work from, and that's where people actually got good at sword fighting. Step one, from the Army standpoint in training sword fighting, was get people confident enough that they don't run away when it's a sword fight. The reality on most battlefields, of course, is that running away is what decides things and not the kill count. So you want people to be confident enough to not run away. So if you're training this at home, you don't have a nice sword in all likelihood. And if you do, cool, all right? So you don't have to use a real sword to do this training with, because a lot of it doesn't have to do with what's in your hand. It's what you're doing with the rest of your body. So you could use something small like this ruler we've got here, just a basic little stick to help illustrate our point here about, you know, how I'm using this sword here. It's got a nice defined edge too, which matters in the way I do the sword here. It's not going to behave exactly the same as a sword, but it's a great starting point, and I don't want anyone to feel limited because they don't have the perfect equipment. Here we've got a piece of PVC that we got from the plumbing section at a home improvement store. This, you know, has the right sort of length. It's going to move a little bit more like a sword than the stick does. And it also makes a good starting training tool, in part specifically because it is light. I don't want you to get so tired you can't do the techniques correctly. That's not good training, all right? So we've got something like this, and you could grab a stick from the woods. All sorts of things from your house might potentially work from this. Don't grab something too heavy, and don't grab something that's got something heavy on the end, because that's going to end up messing with the way this works in a way that's counterproductive to trying to learn this material here. So let's get on to the lesson now. All right, so the manual drill. One of the things to consider at the outset is that the manual drill assumes that everyone is right-handed because it was an 18th and 19th century military drilling system. So everyone has to fight the same way because they're fighting in a regiment. However, of course, some of you are not going to be right-handed, in which case you're just going to do this left-handed, and when I say dominant foot forward, the left-handed folks will put their left foot forward, right? And the right-handed folks will put their right foot forward. Now, when I say cut down from your left to your right, that's going to be the same regardless of which hand you're doing it with. All right. So the cut left to right, cut left to right. They're going to be the same regardless of whether or not you're right or left-handed, and that preserves the ability for this drill to be a paired activity between two people who aren't the same hand. It does create a couple of all of the other small changes that will show up, and I'll highlight those as we go through. So, first, start with your feet together, right? Then you're going to turn your non-dominant foot out by 90 degrees, right? And you're going to step forward with your dominant foot until your heels are under your shoulders. And then I want you to sort of bounce in place a little bit like this, okay? Get a sense of like, I want to have the ability to spring in my step. I'm not locked out. I'm not as tall as I can be. I'm in this sort of bouncy, relaxed sort of position, okay? So our basic stance, this is our basic stance, and our basic guard is going to be this here, like here. And from the camera view here right now, what you can see is that my weapon is sloped across the width of my body, and my hand is at the level of my shoulder, okay? So because my weapon is sloped across the width of my body, I'm protecting my whole self against attacks from my opponent. I don't have to have my weapon out here, all right, because that protects a bunch of space that I don't need to protect. So here, and this allows me to have my weapon as angled as far forward as I can, to thereby present as much of a threat to my opponent as I can, while still having that protected position. So from here, we're going to throw our first attack. And I want you to watch the point of my sword as I do this. I throw a big circle, all right? And there's a reason we practice with sticks instead of sharp swords first. It's that you should be almost brushing your ear as you do this, all right? You know, try not to actually hit yourself in the head with a stick too often, but we all do it, all right? If you're underage and your parents are watching, tell them you'll be careful, you know. So this is our basic first cut, all right? And this action is referred to as a moulinet, which means little windmill, because my action looks kind of like a windmill, and the center of that circle is here at my wrist. Okay? So this gives us our basic downward cut, straight down upon our opponent's head. So this would hit me here. Okay? So the next action of the drill is going to be a parry against that same attack. And so what we're going to do is we're going to come up into a position like this. And this is referred to as St. George's Guard. And this drill was taught to good Christian young men. And I mention this because of the fact that in Christian iconography, St. George is very commonly depicted in one of two positions. He's either slaying the dragon or holding his sword like this. The result of which is that when you say to a Christian in 18th or 19th century Europe, St. George's Guard, they already know what it looks like. It's a nice, quick way to approach teaching people this basic guard. And it covers the width of my body here with a strong part of my sword. So even if my opponent's attack is varied a little bit, I'm defended against that attack. So you come on guard, you cut straight down, and then you bring it into St. George's Guard, and then reset. Do that a few times on your own, and then we'll add our next action in. So our next action, from St. George's Guard, we're to cut downwards from left to right. All right? And downwards from left to right means I'm going to finish with my hand in front of my shoulder here like this, and my weapon across here. Now this is an attack to my cheek here. And so to get to that parry against my cheek here, I'm going to bring simply compact my guard from this is where I finish the cut to here, and that provides me with a nice solid defense here. When you're doing this on your own at home, one of the things to watch for is to make sure that you're keeping your guards compact so that your hand position is always in here, all right, instead of getting way out wide. That's one of the most common sorts of errors we see in folks who are new to this. So from St. George's Guard, I cut down and I bring it here. Now I want to introduce our two basic pieces of footwork. When we attack, we're going to lunge. And the lunge here is not an exciting, incredibly long modern fencing lunge, because our attack here needs to be one that works on a battlefield if it's just rained and there's people's blood all over the place, okay? So what I'm not going to do, I'm going to make sure I don't tear my pants demonstrating this, is this, all right? That's sort of the common picture of a modern lunge. It makes sense in that context. It doesn't make sense on the battlefield. Instead, my lunge is going to look like this. I moved about a foot and a half, 18 inches, all right, about 45 centimeters. Right? My objective is to get there quickly. My objective is not to get as far as possible. One of the other advantages of this shorter lunge is that it means I can recover back to my defended position more easily. This is more important in a real sword fight than it is in modern fencing. The other piece of footwork is the shift or slip. And this is the only component of what we refer to as Scottish broadsword that is in fact unique to Scottish broadsword. And so what we're going to do is we simply bring our feet together like this. And so when I'm facing my opponent, this brings me back, and that's the footwork that I do every time I defend. So every attack in this drill is done with a lunge, every defense is done with a shift, and so on and back and forth like this. Okay? So take a few minutes, practice those pieces of footwork on your own, and then we'll continue. So, our drill. What we have right now so far is I lunge, I cut straight down, bring it back into St. George's Guard, I cut from left to right, and then I protect my right cheek. From here, I'm going to cut downwards from right to left. Here, all right, and then I'm going to protect this cheek simply by compacting my guard in like this. From the side then, I'm here, cut out, I bring it in here. All right? Same basic principle between the second and third action, the second and third cut, and the guards that go with them. All right? This is one spot where if you're left-handed, you reverse the order of the guards. I'm going to do the guard that's across my body first, and the guard that's on the same side of my body second when I'm doing this left-handed. So those three pieces together. 1 and 2 and 3 and. My next action is going to be a horizontal cut across from left to right. So from here, I cut horizontal across from left to right. And this is an attack to here against me. And so my defense against that is very simply going to be drop my point, leave my hand in front of my shoulder. And so then my opponent's sword gets parried here as they attempt to cut to my ribs. So from here, I cut out horizontally, drop into that guard. Now I'm going to throw a horizontal cut the other direction, from right to left, across here, okay? So this is a bigger action, all right? A little bit different action than we've done so far. And then we have the parry against that. And this is the one where I'm going to break it down into small pieces, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my hand over, drop my point, and then bring my hand into this position here, where my hand is now in front of my opposite shoulder. And you'll note this, my hand is in front of one shoulder or the other shows up a lot in these systems as a way to gauge whether or not I'm in the right position. And so this gives me a defense against an attack coming this way against my side and my abdomen here. So I'm in this guard here, I cut across, turn it over, drop my point, bring it in. If you don't do that guard transition in that order, what ends up happening is your sword ends up outside of your opponent's sword is here cutting into you, and you actually end up adding to their hit as opposed to stopping it. Obviously not what we're looking for. From the top then it looks like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and. Our next attack is going to be an attack to the leg. So I'm going to throw a descending cut from right to left, except now instead of aiming at my opponent's head or torso, I'm going to aim at here on their leg. So from here, cut downwards here. Now, one of the characteristic components of this system is that we don't parry attacks to the leg. Instead, what we're going to do against attacks to the leg is cut to our opponent's head while we shift at the same time, because we have a trigonometric advantage here to use. So Mika, come forward here a second. We're going to illustrate this. Right? So if we're both on guard here and Mika cuts to my leg, all right, I am safe against his leg attack, but he is not safe from my counter attack. Basic geometry advantage that we've got here. So we don't parry the leg attack. So instead of parrying the leg attack here, from here, what we're going to do is we're going to come up here into St. George's guard because we're worried about our opponent throwing a high-low combo feint. Right? And also because when I throw a leg attack, I know my opponent is attacking at my head, and so I'm going to need to go from that leg attack into St. George's guard. Right? So in a real sword fight, if I were going for someone's leg, I would almost certainly do this. Okay? So, cut to the leg, come up here into St. George's guard. Our last action of the drill is a rising cut from right to left here. Okay? And the idea here is that you're going to hit your opponent's extended arm. So, Mika, let me borrow you again for a second. Mika cuts to my head here. I parry in St. George's guard, and then I'm going to throw this cut here. That's what I'm trying to do against him. All right? And so, cutting upward at my opponent's arm, all right? And we've got the same basic concept we used several times before. I'm just going to compact my position to come into the parry for this. You note that the stick, the blade is in line with my forearm. If I'm over here like this or like this, then it doesn't protect me adequately. Straightforward is like this. If you come to this position and you're like, wow, this is super awkward, don't worry, that doesn't mean you're doing it wrong, all right? Yes, it's awkward. We know it is. If it feels awkward, you're probably doing it right, because there are less awkward things you might instinctively do that are incorrect. So the complete drill from the top then ends up looking like this. Right? I come on guard, and I go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and recover. We're going to go through that one more time, talking through it a little bit. So I start on guard, cut straight down, protect my head, cut left to right, protect my right cheek, cut right to left, protect my left cheek, cut horizontally from left to right, protect my ribs, cut horizontally from right to left, protect my abdomen, cut to the leg, protect my head, cut right to left upwards, protect my arm, recover back into my starting position. And that's the complete drill.